Let's talk mutants, cultists, and looted mining gear, which are the strongest and weakest units in the Genestealer Cult Codex. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Genestealer cults and talking about every unit in the Codex and how well I think they stack up against each other. The Codex has been out for around about 2 months now. It does seem to have given people enough time to get some serious playtesting in with these and a few top lists to come in. Though I must admit for a 9th edition Codex they do seem remarkably well balanced, maybe being a bit more on the same level as all the codexes that have come before, as opposed to vastly more powerful than them. In any case, today I thought we'd talk through each unit in the Codex. I've arranged them into 3 rough tiers of power. We'll start with the lowest in tier 3, and then move on to the strongest in tier 1. I'll briefly talk through why I've chosen to rank them how I have, and my feelings on which units are most likely to get used in top armies compared with each other. Lots to talk about then, so let's jump straight into it. So first up, we'll start with some of the less competitive units in the Codex, at least in my opinion. Interestingly, out of the Genestealer Cult Codex, I do feel that the majority of choices are actually really quite well balanced, and even though the Codex is perhaps a fairly small one as it goes in terms of Games Workshop books, they've largely done pretty well to make sure the vast majority of units have a good niche. For me, I feel that the units that are most likely to get overlooked are probably the lesser taken characters though, just because there's quite so many characters within the Cult Codex, several of them that you're going to want to take in almost every single list, plenty of which are really useful to bring along, so it means that any of them that aren't standout are just basically never going to get taken. That's why I've chosen to rank these where I have, basically characters that I feel are rarely going to get picked compared with all the competitors. First up we have the Clamavus, the comms and loudspeaker guy, who used to give a +1 to charge in the previous codex, but I think was maybe downgraded a bit in importance. He mainly does 2 different things now, has an unreliable way to turn off Obsec if you can roll 3d6 higher than the enemy's leadership, allows a unit to shoot while doing an action, and also has a scrambler array to stop enemy reinforcements coming in too close. With little to no damage output, I don't think that's usually going to be enough to justify himself. I think maybe the shoots while doing an action could be one of the most useful tricks he has, but unfortunately when he's 50 points, you could maybe even bring an entire extra squad of acolytes just to do that action, and then at least when they're done with it you've got a very threatening squad on the board. He just seems to bring not all that much for his points in my opinion. Next up, and kind of sadly, we have the Reductus Saboteur. Definitely a fun new model with some cool abilities. A ranged attack with her remote explosives, and can also do that action to lay down an explosive marker on an objective. I think her main issue is that she doesn't really do enough damage unless your opponent does have vehicles and monsters along, as she gets damage 3 against them with her attacks, and only damage 1 against anything else. Perhaps a reasonable enough pick if you do know that vehicles and monsters are definitely coming, but perhaps just not as much of a take-all-comers thing as other choices. And I feel if you do just want a deep strike ranged damage dealer, you're probably going to be better off with a Kellamorph, Wormtooth rounds, and automatic exposed. That guy's going to be great at damaging virtually anything, and is particularly good at offing 3 wound infantry, which the Reductus Saboteur isn't particularly good at. I certainly wouldn't say useless, but a little bit overshadowed. Next up, and back in the HQ section, is the Jackal Alphas. I feel out of the 5 HQ slots, this one's going to be the least likely to be taken. Basically bringing a reasonably powerful sniper rifle alongside the buff to give 1 core unit exposed on 1 target, but the combination just doesn't really seem to be quite enough to make the cut. If you're going for a buffing character, people seem to prefer the Primus, and the Sanctus seems a lot more popular if you want to do sniping. If it is desperately important to get the exposed rule for your shooting attacks, you can often get it in other ways as well, either with a bit of genuine clever manoeuvring, or just using a proficient planning upgrade. Finally for tier 3 we have the Abominant, newly moved into the Elite's choice from the HQ. His melee is fairly heavy hitting with D3 plus 3 damage, but it is kind of held back with a 3+ weapon skill and only 3 attacks, which doesn't enormously help matters. Really, I think to justify taking him you do need to be taking Aberrants, as he gives them full rerolls to hit in melee nearby. Unfortunately, generally people seem to prefer other choices of the main damage dealers to Aberrants, and I think therefore it just leaves the Abominant in a super niche spot. A bit of a take or leave upgrade to a unit that isn't exactly seen as one of the stars of the Codex anyway. Doesn't seem bad if you are bringing Aberrants along, but certainly pretty pointless if you aren't. Moving on, we're going into tier 2. These I'd all consider to be usable units, but maybe just not the top tier most standout units in the book. These guys just seem a little bit more take or leave to me, at least compared with some of the other options. First up we have the Sanctus, which is maybe the choice that I was most on the fence about, either upper tier 2 or lower tier 1. He's got a kind of rare weapon in 40k that's an auto-hitting sniper rifle. Can be potentially very good for handing out a crossfire marker, or pinging the last wound or so quite reliably off an injured enemy. He's potentially very dangerous against snipers who can trigger Perils of the Warp on with his stratagem, and also take down enemy aura abilities for a turn, which potentially could be very annoying. Despite having some seriously powerful abilities though, I do feel he is just a little bit on the pricey side. Bodyguard rules often mean that he's just not going to be able to target characters at all, or if they're hiding behind terrain, and even with a decent enough sniper rifle, his damage output for the points isn't spectacular. He's not the sort of model that's going to threaten to take out most characters in a single turn of shooting. Still though, a good model and very usable, and as I mentioned, I could have certainly been persuaded to put him in lower tier 1 instead. Next up we have the Biophagus. I'd rate this guy as top tier in Twisted Helix with a Patriarch, but maybe less so elsewhere. I'd argue that probably his best trick is handing out things like Feel No Pain type saves, particularly to Aberrants, but with Twisted Helix he can give a Warlord Patriarch multiple genomic enhancements, making him both a lot tougher and a lot fightier. Being able to buy in a 5+ Feel No Pain for just a few points with proficient planning is no bad thing either. In game he might not be quite as useful, though he's only 40 points, he has a little bit of melee threat and can also try and augment more squads opportunistically. And I think for how cheap he is, he does add some very interesting options, more army construction than anything else. Next up we come to the Goliath Rock Grinder, which for the points cost I really don't think is too bad, as a fairly cheap and annoying threat to shove up the board. An interesting combination of a little bit of firepower, melee and transport. I'd say probably the biggest issue that it has though is the very low transport capacity. A lot of people in top lists appear to be taking trucks over the Rock Grinder, mainly as they're a kind of necessary delivery system for any of the acolytes and things starting on the board. And with only 6 models in the Rock Grinder, you're often not going to get the combat units to the sort of critical mass that they need to overwhelm targets. I think that on the strength of the datasheet it really isn't too bad, but it perhaps just struggles for a place in the list compared with all the other things that Genestealer cults want to do. Next up we come to the Aberrants. 30-point elite models with damage 3 weapons, at least moderately tough with their toughness 5 and their -1 damage, and are pretty much designed to be taking out the enemy's heavy hitters. For that job they really don't do too badly, and it's nice that they have a little bit more staying power than some of the other units, though I do feel that you pay a fairly hefty premium for them. And as they go it seems that people tend to prefer running Acolytes or pure strain Genestealers over the Aberrants, just as slightly more general purpose melee hammers, still able to do some very decent damage to big enemy heavy hitters, but also tangle with things like troops and infantry all that much better. I feel that Aberrants could maybe use a small points cut. I don't think they'd really need all that much to make them a bit more competitive with Acolytes or pure strains. Finally for tier 2 we have the Locust, a 50-point bodyguard and melee character. He has a fair few of the rules that are kind of common for champions in 40k, being able to heroic intervene long distances and also fights first. He's not very tough, but he does put out some fairly reasonable melee damage just for himself. 5 attacks at strength 5, AP -3 and damage 2 are going to leave a mark. But also his bodyguard rule could be fairly useful to have on the table, stopping any shooting attacks against one key target. Again, he perhaps doesn't really feel like a very necessary character, one that most lists could potentially leave at home, but for a fairly cheap points investment I think there's at least a reasonable chance that he'll do more damage in melee than his points cost was really worth. And if he can manage that while also protecting an important character for a few turns, then I guess could maybe be kind of tempting. Finally we get on to tier 1, the Genestealer cult units that I think are most likely to see play in the top lists for the faction. As you can see I've ranked an absolute ton of stuff here. I do feel that most of the Codex really is very usable indeed, though out of these tier 1 choices I've chosen to rank the pure strain Genestealers, Acolyte hybrids and Patriarch maybe as being top of the bunch, feeling like some of the most necessary units that I think almost every single Genestealer cult army will have in abundance. Starting out we have those pure strains. Kind of nice that they actually made the Genestealers good in a Genestealer cult codex now. Lots of good things to say about these guys. A 4+ invul save, advance and charge, 4 AP3 attacks hitting on 2s, and they even get to strength 5 if you play them in Twisted Helix. I feel that a unit with the proficient planning upgrade that either allows them to pre-game move or go back underground is perhaps an auto-include. Basically if you go first, then you're almost guaranteed to get a first turn charge. A decent movement and being able to advance and charge should easily get them there. Otherwise though, if your opponent goes first and moves something up that might actually be able to get the jump on them, then they can just head underground and pop up later. They don't have core, which means support options are a little bit more limited. but overall I think they're a great premier melee option, will really blend through light infantry, and have enough attacks even to put a decent amount of hurt on heavier targets. Perhaps though the truly most dangerous melee threats in the entire codex could be the Acolyte hybrids. They're really useful either just for utility options or for big charges. 5 model objective secured troops that can deep strike are kind of a godsend in 9th edition. Perfect options for helping win the objective game, and if they do manage to do anything else useful on top of that, then that's kind of a bonus. If you are trying to make them into damage dealers though, then loading them up with a whole bunch of mining weapons of your choice, perhaps giving them things like buffs from a Primus or psychic powers, and then hurling them at the enemy with a crazy bunch of damage dealing threats. They can also deliver some hand flamers if needed as well. Mass strength 3 attacks can be surprisingly effective with crossfire. In any case, I feel like they're the premier troops choice of the codex. I'd be surprised to see any list not including at least a fair portion of them. Finally, out of my 3 favourite units in the codex, we have the Patriarch, a massively fast and dangerous melee HQ, who can also spit out a couple of psychic powers each turn, either just for more damage or to buff other units. For the points I think is really good value. The same very scary threat range as the purestrain Genestealers, able to cross large tracts of the board in a single turn, hopefully buff up any other things that are nearby, or use mass hypnosis to make an enemy unit fight last, and then charge in with a whole bunch of dangerous rending claw attacks at damage 2 and re-rolling wounds. It's also particularly great in the Twisted Helix as well, getting that Biophagus buff, or getting damage 3 on his claws. A very threatening HQ there, so much so that some people seem to want to run 2 of him using different detachments. Moving on, the Primus is maybe the next most popular HQ choice out of any of them. An 80-point character who provides some pretty decent buffs himself with a reroll 1s to hit aura and also making one unit reroll 1s to wound as well. It's fairly fragile but can also lend a hand in melee as well, particularly using that Relic Toxin Injector Claw that has 3 damage. And between his buffing abilities and combat prowess, I think he certainly justifies his points. Next up, we have the Mages, the cheapest way to get those Broodmine Discipline powers on the table. I think they're a really good value Psyker HQ. They might have just a little bit of conflict with the Patriarch for who gets the best powers. I think there's usually enough room for at least 2 Psykers though in most Genestealer lists. Perhaps quite a good choice for that Unwilling Orb relic as well, the one that allows them to deny any psychic powers anywhere on the board. And the Mages can also provide a little bit of mortal wound protection to nearby units, which is quite relevant in certain matchups. Next up, we have Mr. Kellermorph with the 3 pistols, the deep strike sniping character that can take out enemy warlords, or just mow through an absolute ton of light infantry. He's particularly vicious when souped up with the Wormtooth rounds and the auto-exposed proficient planning ability. Usually 6 shots at strength 6, AP-3, damage 3 are going to be enough to punch a hole in most things, particularly with +1 to wounds. I think a Kellermorph is just a really spooky threat to have on the board. Very hard to screen indeed, when he can drop anywhere that's greater than 6 inches away from the enemy, and unleash absolutely massive damage output with a fairly decent range at 18 inches as well. Certainly very easy to kill if you can get damage to him, but that ability to move after shooting is very nice indeed. Should hopefully help to keep him safe, and for 2 CP, firing in death could lead to a brutal volley in the enemy's turn. Next up, we come to the hybrid metamorphs, basically fancy acolytes with extra AP and a fights in death rule. I feel that they are generally quite useful, though maybe a secondary choice to the acolytes, perhaps a unit that you might want to take if you're running out of troop slots within the army, but you do want even more hybrid bodies on the table. Perhaps not really too much more to say about them though. In general, I'd rather be taking acolytes over them for the most part, between the mining weapons, objectives secured, and being a fair bit cheaper, but I still think metamorphs are going to get played a fair bit, perhaps mainly due to detachment slots. Next up we have the Goliath truck. 90 points for a 10 wound toughness 6 transport, though is a little bit more durable than you might expect with its -1 damage. I feel that Goliath trucks are a pretty good option for starting infantry on the board. Not everything is going to be able to start underground, so it's quite a solid fast option for getting things like acolytes on the board where they need to go, and hopefully not get shot up too badly while they're doing so. Once it's done with transporting, it can still make itself useful, handing out crossfire markers with that 2 damage autocannon, doing nuisance charges, or maybe just getting in a decent position to trigger the explosed rule for other shooting units. The Acolyte Icon Ward is the last of the HQs, 75 points for basically bringing 2 different abilities to the table. First up, it can allow nearby units to summon the Cult, hopefully replenishing a few models to the squad if they happen to be nearby. But I would say perhaps the more useful ability is the Sacred Cult Banner. which basically allows nearby units to have +1 to charge. Great to combine with units rising up from underground. If you do want to pull off some deep strike charges, it seems like a pretty reasonable way to go. Usually going to be needing an 8-inch charge, perhaps getting 3d6-inch drop the lowest with that particular proficient planning upgrade, but if you want to get more reliable charges off the same turn, then 7 inches is a lot more reliable, particularly if you budget in a command point reroll. For me, that's the ability that I'd be wanting to take the Icon Ward for, perhaps a slightly expensive premium on getting some 7-inch charges off. Next up we have the Nexos, the Elite's Choice strategist that can hand out crossfire markers and helps buffing characters. I think he'd be a reasonable choice to follow something like a Primus around in the game, broadcasting his buffs nearby, handing out the crossfire marker, and perhaps most importantly using that cranial inlay relic. That's the one that regenerates command points on a 5+, and could potentially well be worth the price of inclusion almost by itself. Again, like quite a lot of them, he does feel like a bit of an add-on character that might not be strictly necessary, but brings a lot of good stuff for its cheap cost. The Atalan Jackals are the irritating screening biker unit. Fairly cheap to put a squad of them on the table at 48 points for 4 of them, and really quite a nice choice for seizing control of the table in the early game. They get a 9-inch pre-game move before the game begins, good for helping push back the enemy, perhaps a good unit for screening and making sure that the enemy doesn't get too comfortable on midfield objectives, and also do a whole bunch of other helpful things as well, bullying some light infantry with their small damage output. Could easily be a great unit for making units exposed with the crossfire, and for their points cost they do have really quite decent defense as well, 2 wounds and toughness 4, and -1 to hit in all phases. Perhaps not really a unit to go too crazy on, but 1 or 2 units for scouting and nuisance duties do seem like they're a really good investment. The Neophyte hybrids are next, the faction's other major troops choice, and perhaps one of the biggest units that actually really want to be making good use of crossfire and exposed. You can get really quite a lot of shots out of a unit, but they're perhaps kind of underwhelming unless you can make maximal use of crossfire. If they're going for damage dealing, I'd be most tempted by big blocks of them with seismic cannons, nice mid-strength guns that are really going to light +1 to wound, or potentially you could take smaller squads for actions and objective holding. They are a little bit more durable per point than things like Acolytes, but I think in general Acolytes are usually going to win the battle for that, as they cost 45 points for their minimum size squads, and these guys cost 60. I think out of the 2 troops I do slightly prefer Acolytes, but against certain units it is just going to be a fair bit easier to deal with them in shooting and not in combat, so having a couple of damage dealing hammers of Neophytes isn't really the worst thing either, particularly when they can put a whole load of bodies on objectives. Finally, we come to the Achilles Ridge Runners, who I feel are potentially an interesting first turn Alpha Strike choice, as you can put them in strategic reserve for just 10 points with proficient planning. Between that and their heavy mining lasers, I feel they are perhaps one of the better longer range anti-tank choices, though basically like most of the Genestealer Cult Codex, I don't really think it's all that impressive for them unless they do manage to get crossfire and exposed. Still though, perhaps one of the single best dedicated choices of anti-tank fire in the Codex, and being able to basically guarantee themselves an Alpha Strike really is quite nice. So I think that just about brings us to the end of our Codex Genestealer Cult tier list. Please let me know what you think down in the comments below, and as always, very happy to hear any discussion of any units that you think I've ranked too high or too low. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k stuff coming, with new videos out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. The channel's Patreon is what allows me to keep on making so many videos so regularly on the channel, so if you are enjoying regularly, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.